In January 2021, 10 members of Nepali team reached the summit of K2 in winter. It was widely regarded as the last milestone in high altitude mountaineering. Today's climber can only repeat these ascents or try to set fastest known time, but there isn't any significant challenge in the mountaineering world. Except one, the Mount Kailash. Located entirely in the Tibet region, many people believe it is unclimbable. There have been reports of many attempts to conquer the Mount Kailash, but as per the records, there is none who reached the summit of Kailash. Now, Mount Kailash is very popular among many religions, so there are many stories surrounding its climbing history and its failure. Believer has declared this mountain unclimbable, but at the time when we are climbing very difficult peak like Janu East, Latok Phase 1, highly technical peak like Ogre 1 and 2, why would climber fail to climb Mount Kailash? In this video, we will get into the climbing history of Mount Kailash. Many people believe Mount Kailash is a part of Himalayan range, but a clear distinction can be seen between Kailash range and Himalayan range. Kailash range is the part of Transhimalaya, completely different mountain range that lies north and runs parallel to the Himalayan peak. It extends from the south of Tibet to the west of Karakoram peak. The highest peak in the Kailash range is not the Mount Kailash but is Lumpu Gangri that stands at 7,095 meters. Yet the most popular peak is the second highest peak in this mountain range, Mount Kailash, at an altitude of 6,638 meters. This is the sacred mountain in four religions. Early exploration of Mount Kailash was more of religious significance, where few monks from India and Nepal reached Kailash Mansarovar. There is a reference in Gupta dynasty. The ancient routes like Lipulik Pass, Hilsa Pass were used by the monks, but only a handful of people knew about the route for centuries. Though it was difficult to reach from Himalayan route, Mount Kailash was not isolated and remote mountain. In fact, Tibetan people have been living very close to the mountain for thousands of years. Local people offer daily prayers to the Mount Kailash. For centuries, there have been Buddhist monasteries near Mount Kailash, but for the most part of the history, Tibet was closed to European. In 19th century, Nansing Rawat from Kumaon traveled to Tibet from Himalaya. He visited Mansarovar Lake and Rakshatal and mapped out the routes. This later helped Europeans find their way to Kailash. Somewhere between 1906 and 1908, Sven Hedin explored the western Tibet, where the Kailash range is located. He was the first European to reach the Mansarovar and Rakshatal, but nobody ever attempted to climb Mount Kailash until 1926, when Hugh Ruttledge and R.C. Wilson made their trip to Kailash. They crossed the border from Lipulik Pass and successfully reached the Darchin. This was perhaps the first time anyone was looking away to reach the summit of Mount Kailash. R.C. Wilson was accompanied by a Sherpa called Satan, who had worked as a porter in Everest expedition. Second team was led by Rutledge. He was accompanied by a few Bhutia traders from India. The initial plan was to follow the pilgrim route around the Kailash, also known as Kora, which revolves around the Mount Kailash covering almost 54 kilometers. But the R.C. Wilson was not attracted by the idea of doing Kora. Instead, he inquired the local priest about the possible route to the south face of Kailash, which starts from Dorchen itself. The local priest initially told him that the route was possible, but he wasn't quite sure about that. Anyway, R.C. Wilson decides to separate from Rutledge and planned his route to the southwest face of Kailash. On the other hand, Rutledge continued his way to the Dirfu Monastery. Dirfu Monastery is a historical landmark on the pilgrim route Kora. It is known for the spectacular view of north face of Kailash. R.C. Wilson left Dorchin with little to no information of summit route. They headed straight toward the south face and then turned left to enter the narrow, dark and steep valley. From there, they could see the southwest face of Kailash. Today, this route is known as Inner Kora by the pilgrim. R.C. Wilson entered the valley. A gigantic face of Kailash stopped them to reconsider their attempt. It was only this time they saw the east face of Kailash. R.C. Wilson and Sherpa were convinced that Mount Kailash can be climbed from east ridge with less difficulty, but it was too late for them to reroute their plan. They continued their climb toward the west shoulder of the Kailash. They turned left to face the difficult pinnacle leading to the western ridge of Mount Kailash. The treacherous and dangerous climb to the ridge was exhausting. To make it worse, it began to snow. Suddenly, loud and bright flash of lightning thunder crashed the skies of Kailash range. They felt thunder over their heads. In their own words, truly the guards were resenting our intrusion. They felt it was a warning from the guard, who seems to be angry about their ascent. They stopped right there, disarmed their ice axe to prevent any tragedy caused by the lightning thunder. Once the storm subsided, they continued their climb to the goal on the ridge. The ridge was rather narrow and dangerously steep from both the sides. As they moved along the dangerously narrow ridge, they came face to face with the steep southwest face of Kailash, leading to the summit. It was blocked by the overhanging cornices. Below them lay a pitch-dark abyss of great depth and steepness. Climbing the west shoulder of Kailash would require far more time and effort than they had first thought. They decided to abandon the west face of Kailash. They descended on the other side of the ridge and continued down until they reached the pilgrim route of Khora. By the nightfall, they rejoined Rutledge at Dirufuk Monastery. Rutledge himself was looking for the summit of Mount Kailash, but he wasn't as determined as R.C. Wilson was. In fact, he didn't even attempt any route on Mount Kailash. He thought about climbing north face of Kailash, but as he witnessed the steep north face of Kailash from Dirafuk Monastery, he gave up his thought of climbing and declared Mount Kailash unclimbable. Both Wilson and Rutledge later completed the Kora around the Kailash and returned back home. Since then, there have never been any serious attempt of climbing Kailash. The Tibet had been the part of Chinese political unrest, and China has been really careful about any kind of political influence in the Tibet region. It was in 1980 when Chinese government themselves made an offer to Reinhold Messner and invited him to climb Mount Kailash. Now, Reinhold Messner was no ordinary mountaineer. He climbed the Mount Everest with no supplementary oxygen or Sherpa support. He went on to become the legendary mountaineer by climbing all 14 8,000 without supplementary support. Inviting such mountaineer to climb Mount Kailash would have highest rate of success. When invitation reached the Messner, he simply declined the offer. He knew that how much Mount Kailash hold importance to other religions. He said, if we conquer this mountain, then we conquer something in people's soul. And I would suggest they go and climb something a little harder. In 1998, a joint team of China and Korea attempted to climb Kailash. The route taken is still unknown, but some Tibetan monk warned them about the consequences of their action. Yet some climbers defied the warning of monks and continued their climb. It was said that they reached the summit ridge of Kailash, the snow-covered cornice that take one to the summit of the Mount Kailash. When the team approached the true summit of Kailash, some team members started feeling ill. Headache and loss of coordination was reported. It made them rethink their decision. At the end, they abandoned their attempt to climb Mount Kailash. Some sources also report that these climbers experienced rapid aging and died within a year of attempting Kailash. Now, these stories are very popular among the Tibetan tour operator, but there is no evidence of such team with Chinese Mountaineering Association, who is responsible for granting the permit and record keeping any mountaineering activity in China and Tibet. In 2001, a Spanish team asked Chinese government to grant permit for climbing Mount Kailash. Their permit was denied, and from that time we know that Chinese government has officially banned climbing Mount Kailash. So they hardly grant any permit for climbing or trekking in the Tibet region. The highest peak, Mount Everest, can be climbed from the north side, from the Chinese side, but China don't always grant permit to the climber. A news media from India reported an attempt by Sergei Sistakov. A Russian climber and his team made an attempt to climb Mount Kailash. The route chosen was Southeast Ridge, which was investigated by the R.C. Wilson in 1926. At that time, R.C. Wilson said, If I ever return, he will attempt the southeast ridge of Mount Kailash because it was less steep and feasible. According to the Indian media, as Sarkari started ascending the ridge, they experienced intense pounding of heart and sudden sense of weakness. The team progressed to some height but encountered severe weakness like headache, muscle cramp, difficulty in breathing, and feeling of disorientation. Finally, Sarkari said, "This mountain is not accepting me," and decided to abandon the attempt of climbing Mount Kailash. He described the difficulty of climbing Kailash as if God himself was stopping him from the ascent. According to Indian media, Sarkari had extensive mountaineering experience across the Himalayas. In the real mountaineering world, Sarkari is pretty much unknown. There is no documentation of his climb of Mount Kailash. As per the Indian media, he was the Russian mountaineer, but Russian Mountaineering Foundation has no evidence or any kind of documentation of his climb. In reality, there has only been one attempt to climb Mount Kailash, and that was by R.C. Wilson and Porter in 1926. Since then, we have never seen any attempt of climbing Mount Kailash, and we don't need to climb Mount Kailash either. It's not very difficult or not very technical, and it's a sacred peak, and it belongs more to the religious people than to the mountaineer.